The gun went off, and instantly the air turned into a choking gray fog. There were 32 men standing at the starting line that afternoon in St. Louis. Within 3 hours, one would be hallucinating. One would be chased a mile off course by a pack of wild dogs. One would be poisoned by his own trainers. And one would nearly die from breathing in the dust of the Missouri roads. Another would cross the finish line first, smiling and waving, only to be revealed as a fraud who had driven half the race in a car. This wasn't just a foot race. It was a grotesque experiment in human endurance, set against the backdrop of the grandest spectacle America had ever seen. This is the story of the 1904 Olympic Marathon, the most bizarre sporting event in human history. Part 1. The Stage of Dust and Heat. To understand the madness of August 30, 1904, you have to understand the setting. The United States was hosting its first Olympic Games, but they were essentially a sideshow attached to the colossal St. Louis World's Fair. The organizers wanted to showcase American grandeur, but for the marathon, they chose a route that seemed designed by a sadist. The course was 24.85 miles long. It wasn't a paved track. It was a brutal gauntlet of dirt roads, encompassing 7 treacherous hills. To make matters worse, the race started at 3 p.m., the absolute hottest part of the day. The temperature was soaring past 90 degrees F, 32 degrees Celsius, with humidity that made the air feel like wet wool. But the true villain of this story was a man named James Sullivan. Sullivan was the chief organizer of the Games, and he was a man obsessed with purposeful dehydration. He wanted to use the marathon as a physiological experiment to test the limits of purposeful thirst. Consequently, on a 25-mile course in blistering heat, there were only 2 water stations. One was a water tower at the 6-mile mark. The other was a roadside well at 12 miles. That was it. For the rest of the race, the runners were on their own. Part 2. The Cast of Characters. The lineup of athletes was as eclectic as it was unprepared. Among the serious American runners, like Sam Mellor and Thomas Hicks, there was a motley crew of international participants who seemed to have wandered onto the track by accident. There was Felix Carvajal, a Cuban postman. He had no money, no trainer, and no running gear. He had raised money to come to the U.S. by running around Havana, but lost it all in a craps game in New Orleans. He hitchhiked to St. Louis and arrived at the starting line wearing street clothes, heavy shoes, long trousers, and a long-sleeved white shirt. Just minutes before the gun fired, a friendly American discus thrower grabbed a pair of scissors and cut Carvajal's trousers into jagged shorts so he wouldn't collapse from heat stroke. Then there were Len Tao and Jan Mashiani, 2 Tswana tribesmen from South Africa. They weren't there for the Olympics. They were actually part of a Boer War reenactment exhibit at the World's Fair. They ran barefoot. They were the first black Africans to ever compete in the modern Olympics. And finally, there was Fred Lors, a bricklayer from New York. He was a prankster, a man with a smile that suggested he knew something no one else did. Part 3. The Chaos Begins. When the pistol fired, the runners surged forward, but immediately disaster struck. The organizers had allowed cars carrying doctors, judges, and reporters to drive ahead of the runners. In 1904, cars had no emission standards and kicked up massive amounts of dirt. The roads were dry. The caravan of automobiles churned the dirt into impenetrable clouds of dust. The runners weren't just battling heat, they were inhaling thick grit with every breath. William Garcia of California was one of the favorites. 7 miles in, he wasn't just tired, he was dying. The dust had coated his esophagus and ripped apart his stomach lining. He collapsed on the side of the road, hemorrhaging. If he hadn't been found an hour later, he would have bled to death internally. Meanwhile, the Cuban postman Felix Carvajal was running a